Okay, today we're going to talk about Mesoamerican civilizations. So last time we defined what Mesoamerica was, where it is in kind of southern modern day Mexico, mostly around the Yucatan Peninsula and moving a little bit further west. Today we're going to talk about Mesoamerican civilizations going way back and up till they started farming in around 5000 BCE or so. Mesoamerica is extremely important to Native American development because we believe it is the first place where Native Americans started the agricultural revolution. Basically, they started uh, permanent settlements and building farmland around those settlements so that they can control nature, they can control their food supply, create their own food supply for long-term planning. So their populations in Mesoamerica will start to grow because they have consistent access to a food source, and the idea of farming and settlement will spread to much of the rest of the Americas from Mesoamerica. So it's really the starting point for this type of revolution. Mesoamerica from 5000 BCE or so is very politically fragmented, which means it did not have just one kingdom or one political entity or one government that ruled over the whole place for the whole time since 5000 until basically the Spanish start to arrive in the 1500s CE. We believe that there were several different civilizations in Mesoamerica, and several internally within those civilizations, there was no dominant government very often. So the civilization would be kind of collections of different governments and different kingdoms and city states that rule their own areas and interact with each other. So farming societies had emerged around 5000 BCE or so, and the first major kind of long-term civilization that we start to see is actually the Olmec Civilization that starts around 1200 BCE and lasts for about 800 years or so, to about 400 BCE. So they are long gone by the time we get to year zero. Uh, Historians believe that the Olmec worshipped polytheistic gods, which means uh, several gods that derived usually from natural phenomenon like floods and harvests and the weather patterns of the seasons. So they are polytheistic, which means they believe in many gods, whereas monotheism believes in just one god that controls everything or creates everything. The polytheistic gods that the Olmec worshipped appear to have been both male and female, and often that a single god could have both attributes or could represent itself in the kind of human worldly form, either as a male or a female, depending on circumstances. We believe that the Olmec political leaders also controlled the religion, so the political leaders of the government were also the religious leaders in the society. That they kept large trade networks with neighboring areas and neighboring groups, and that they often attacked those neighboring groups to acquire territory or just to acquire prisoners of war for bloodletting rituals and rituals and ceremonies to appease their gods. We think that the Olmec developed an advanced mathematical system built on the number 20, so that was their base number, and a lot of their further calculations and their architecture and even their kind of calendar systems were built on the number 20, so say 20 months in a year instead of what we have today. One of the most impressive things about the calendar is that the Olmec created what would eventually become known as the long count calendar, which they believed attributed or counted really every day and every year since the beginning of creation, which they thought was a few thousand years ago. And they thought that this calendar would cycle through about 5,000 years or so, and then the world would be recreated. So we don't know if that means that they thought that the world would end in some kind of apocalypse after 5,000 years and then all life would have to start all over again, or if that could just mean a collapse of human civilization that would start all over again, or it could just be some religious interpretation that some kind of great awakening would happen in human society at that 5,000 year period. We don't know for absolute certain really what they believed with that. But the calendar survived the collapse of the Olmec, and future civilizations would use it also. Their monumental architecture was mostly religious in the form of these giant stone heads that you see here. And you can see that these stone heads are 7 or 8 feet tall. They're basically made out of gigantic boulders, pure stone in themselves. That would be very difficult to move because they would weigh massive amounts. And the Olmec didn't appear to have the high technology to move them around very much. So either they were moved by human muscle labor or they were just carved where they sat. We don't know exactly, but the stone heads appear to be in certain specific areas, so we think that they were moved. And they appeared to have been carved with other stone tools. So the Olmec did not seem to have access to higher level metal technology that future civilizations will develop. And again, the Olmec collapsed somewhere around the year 400 BCE. And a few hundred years later, another city much further to the west, in the northwest of the old Olmec area, called Teotihuacan, emerges as a dominant city around the year 100 BCE. So about 300 years later or so. Teotihuacan is much closer to modern-day Mexico City. It's about 35 miles or so northeast of today's Mexico City. Had a gigantic population, we estimate, at somewhere around 150,000 people, which would have been one of the largest human cities in the whole world for its time. We don't know a whole lot about Teotihuacan. It existed for quite a long time, for about 850 years or so, so beyond year zero, and eventually would go into its own collapse phase around 750 CE, 750 years after zero. We know that they worshipped several gods. One of the most important gods was Quetzalcoatl, which appears to have, they thought, controlled the creation of the whole universe or the whole world, fertility, and the wind. So Teotihuacan goes into a decline phase after about 750, and a little bit later, about 150 years or so later, in the early 900s CE, we see the rise of a new group called the Toltec Civilization that also emerge in central Mexico and have their capital city a little bit further north at Tula, which is also on this map. It appears that the Toltec were much more warlike, much more interested in warfare and territorial conquest, and forcing that the groups that they conquered to pay tribute, which means really a kind of yearly tax that the Toltec would demand. Their conquered areas would have to pay this yearly tax to prevent the Toltec from attacking again or conquering more or something like that. And the Toltec could even use that tribute as a threat to places they hadn't even conquered yet, to just basically give them a big lump sum of money, and they would just choose not to attack at that point. So that's usually what tribute is called. It's usually a kind of monthly or yearly payment, scheduled type of payment to avoid war. The city at Tula, we believe, was monumental in scale, had gigantic buildings, had religious and administrative government centers, and was often decorated with war scenes or scenes of sacrifice to their gods. But the Toltec, they don't last very long. They last about 200 years or so, and then they go into their own heavy decline phase in the early 1100s CE. And that brings us to the Mayan civilization. The Maya will rise in the Yucatan Peninsula. On this map, this whole area in red. So they will control a much larger area than either the Olmec or Teotihuacan or even the Toltec had controlled. So Mayan civilization grows geographically very large. They spread out across many, many cities, as you can see in the map here. They seem to have several different kind of linguistic groups, several different languages within their civilization, but even the different linguistic groups had some shared cultural ideals. The Mayan civilization never has one city or one kingdom that is ever powerful enough to conquer or control the entire Mayan civilizational kind of region, the whole geographic location. So Mayan civilization is always split up, broken up into several different powerful cities, powerful kingdoms that are often negotiating with each other, sometimes attacking each other for land. Um, so there's that kind of political dynamic going on where no one group is in control of the whole civilization or the whole area. Um, Archaeologists and historians believe that the Yucatan at that time had pretty weak soil because it had such dense tropical type forests, so it was difficult to raise a large amount of food. They had very unpredictable rain and drought seasons, which made long-term farming and planning, again, very difficult to do. So that meant that the Mayan civilization had to create much better farming technology, much greater advances in their farming in order to survive and thrive in a much more difficult environment to grow food to feed large populations. We believe that the Mayan had their civilizational height between 200 and 900 CE, so they exist alongside at the same time as Teotihuacan and the Toltec. The Maya, we believe their civilization started around 200 CE, so 200 years after zero, and 50 years in they start developing the highest level of their whole historical civilization. Between 250 and 900 CE, at their height, they had several cities that had over 50,000 residents. So again, they would have been the largest cities probably in all the Americas and would have rivaled the size of European cities in those years too. Let's see. Tikal was one of the probably biggest and most powerful cities in the early classic era. Tikal is kind of in the central and eastern coastline on this map. It's a little hard to find because there's so many other cities along the throughout the civilization, but it's kind of central eastern on this map in the red area. So Tikal probably would have had 50,000 residents throughout this whole classic era, these hundreds of years up till 900 CE. A lot of the other even fairly large cities would have probably had about 20,000 residents or so at the time. So Tikal would have been one of the dominant ones. The Mayan civilization, their farming strategy was built on an idea of what we would today call slash and burn farming, which means they would basically go into a forested area and they would cut down the trees or burn down the trees. That's where you get the burn part. Because when you do that, number one, you eliminate the trees and you expose the ground for farming. And number two, the ash from the trees that you burn, if it goes into the soil, it regenerates the soil very quickly and very well. So pretty quickly after you can water down the ashes and you can start growing food in that soil, the soil is very, very productive at first. The problem, though, is that this slash and burn system and then heavy farming on that land tended to deplete the nutrients in the land much more quickly than just cutting out the trees and planting without burning everything down and letting the ash kind of sift into the soil. So it seemed to work really well for the first few years because the land would be extremely abundant, but then the nutrients would be worn out very quickly with the soil, and within a first few years or so, the soil would be so depleted that the crops wouldn't grow very well, and so the farmers would have to move on to the next land over and start the process again. Cut down a bunch of the trees, burn down what's left, get this ash into the soil and start farming again, and that soil would be super abundant and the cycle would repeat. It would kind of go barren again and they would have to move on again and again. So this was extremely environmentally destructive for the long term over generations and generations. And especially when we consider that a lot of these cities were, large populations, had a lot of residents to feed, so they're very dependent on these these farming techniques to grow enough food to feed their growing populations. A lot of local rulers were really desperate to get that food supply as high as possible, so they would build irrigation systems and they would build elevated farm fields to try to bring the water in and manage the water as best they could to increase their crop yield as high as possible to, again, feed their growing populations. A lot of the areas around the Yucatan Peninsula were pretty arid, pretty dry, and again had very unpredictable rain patterns. So that hurt long-term planning. So a lot of times local governments would build water reservoirs and canals to bring the water from one place to another. So they're also getting involved in long-term planning because the weather patterns were so unpredictable, and they were completely dependent on these farming styles. Forest areas that were located kind of in the mountainsides were much more difficult to farm on because of the elevation, number one, and number two, because the mountainside, if you tried to bring the water to it, the water would run down as runoff, and so the Maya had to figure out how to stop that runoff and manage the forest and the mountainsides for the best kind of farming productivity. And they also figured out that they had to keep the wildlife around that were natural to the forest, especially in the mountains. They couldn't just deplete them completely because a lot of the ground in the forest depended on the existence of those animals. So they tried to manage the forest wildlife as best as possible. It appears that all the major Mayan cities had some kind of farming or agricultural countryside next to their city to produce their food. Especially systems of cornfields called milpas that the cities were very heavily dependent on. Let's see, and the big cities and even the fairly large-sized towns built monumental architecture. Especially the biggest cities would obviously have the biggest architecture, especially pyramids. They built elevated housing systems, and very often would build kind of open public spaces around the pyramids or around the big buildings as kind of civic areas where trade and markets and ceremonies could occur. So this is an image of a Mayan plaza, kind of open air area where they had a stage and a little walk up and kind of open space below where they could have shopping and markets on market days, and during ceremonial days they could kind of take those markets down and just have a mass public gathering in front of the stage. Even small towns often built these elevated, at least pyramid, or at least a small plaza with a small stage. So this idea of building these civic areas spread throughout all of Mayan civilization that we know of. So it was extremely important and seemed to be a central part of their entire kind of civilization, their social expectations. It appears that the royals, the kings of cities, or the city leaders, the highest level government leaders, and their nobility, the kind of advisors to the government, tended to lead the public ceremonies and rituals. They were done pretty frequently, even weekly. And we think that a lot of these ceremonies were very heavily scripted, very well planned out, and planned to be very dramatic, with very kind of amazing and expensive costumes that the participants would wear in order to impress the general population and put the population in awe of the government, so that would legitimize the government and people would follow the government's orders. So they had these very dramatic, kind of stylized ceremonies in order to convince the population that the government was right and true, and that the people should basically follow orders. Some of these ceremonies we believed included astronomical constellations, big religious duties, and these were all roles that the political elite and the wealthy elite, the economic elite, the nobles, pretty much controlled themselves. A lot of Mayan buildings had some kind of monumental aspects to them, as we see here. They were often gigantic, especially in the biggest cities. These were major pyramids that were built out of stone, so it took a lot of planning, a lot of logistics, a lot of workmanship, to not just bring the resources there, but to put the resources together to build these giant structures. They often put statues in their pyramids and their public buildings, which we also see here, which would often be brightly colored, to be very lifelike, or to be as stylized as possible to, again, put the people in awe of what was being built, and also to legitimize the political leadership. It often told kind of stories through imagery on the sides of buildings about how great the government was, or how it came into being, or whatever great accomplishments it had done. The Maya also had not developed any great metal technology until their very, very late period. So most of the buildings, the monumental architecture, the statues that we see were kind of built and cut out of stone-based tools, which required much more labor, and shows the craftsmanship, how amazing artistically these kind of sculptors were, to do these things with such low technology tools, and probably the amount of wealth and power that the government had to pay the artists to make these things and to gather enough labor from the population to put the buildings together in the first place. Let's see, so we believe that the Mayan civilization was fairly sexist. The men tended to run governments. They ran religious elites, they ran businesses, and right down to the commoners, the men tended to run the individual households. But Mayan households could commonly hold several generations of extended family. So even if I, as the adult male, was running the household, I might have my parents or grandparents, nieces and nephews all living in this house. So it is the responsibility of the household to provide for members of the family who can't really provide for themselves, the elderly or the sick or the children or something like that. And next step is to get into kind of who ran all these systems, who ran the government, really, and talk about the civilization as a kind of social pyramid. So the elite leaders were the kings. They were chosen through what we call primogeniture, which means the eldest living son of the sitting king will be the next king, and as that new king has children, the oldest of his sons will be the next king in line. So we call that primogeniture. The eldest son inherits everything. Let's see. So the kings led the biggest ceremonies. They had the biggest government decisions. They were the ones really in control. They were said to be able to talk with the deities, the gods, to gain advice from the gods or ask what the gods wanted, and that the kings would often do this through kind of bloodletting ceremonies, where they would strike themselves or cut themselves and release some of their blood, and that would start the ceremony, and they would try to talk to the gods to figure out what the gods wanted. The king's blood was thought to be like the purest blood of all of the civilization, or all of the society. So the king's bloodletting was extremely important and kind of powerful symbol in this civilization. They often might also take hallucinogenics to go into a trance state, where they said that they would converse with the gods and gain advice or follow orders from what the gods want. This is the normal system for their kind of religious and leadership ceremonies through the classic era. After the classic era, the kind of a priesthood develops to run a lot of these ceremonies themselves without so much the king's total personal participation. So you get this priesthood and this kind of nobility that will grow up and will often be like the official record keepers of the royal lineage. they would be the ones that planned out the religious ceremonies, and eventually this priesthood would become the ones that run the ceremonies themselves and maintain the kind of religious calendar and keep track of the astronomical signs, the stars and whatnot. So the nobles were extremely important. These priests and other kind of high-ranking warriors that would rise up to like what we would today call the general level of an army, and to be the officers in the army, so they would lead the armies into war because they had the most experience and were the most brave. The rich, the nobles, could also rise into government as tax collectors, government administrators, kind of mid-level government bureaucrats, basically, that if they didn't have decision-making power themselves, they are responsible for implementing the decisions throughout this city or the kingdom or whatever kind of size political entity we're talking about. And it appears that writing was restricted, education was restricted to the elite, to the nobility. So even knowing how to read and write was a rare thing in Mayan civilization. And the ability to read and write was largely taught to the nobility, probably because they wanted to keep those decision-making or government powers to themselves, and they wanted to restrict the ability of the lower-level commoners to kind of rise up into the elite level. So they just denied the commoners education. And to be a professional scribe and an official record keeper for the government in an era where reading and writing is restricted just to the elite, simply being a record keeper and an archivist, these scribes were extremely important to government because they had to keep official records of how much money is being collected or how many goods are being collected in taxes from different areas, and what how many resources it's going to take to build the newest canal or the newest aqueduct or the newest reservoir or something like that. So scribes became extremely important because education is so restricted in the Mayan civilization. Some women were able, from the nobility, to rise up to be political leaders in some cities. So it's not so sexist that they keep women out of all kind of powerful and useful offices and just keep them at home. Women could rise in politics, and women could run their own governments, or run the local government. Women could also run their own households and run their own family businesses. So it is not so sexist that women are completely oppressed to the point where they have no opportunities at all. Next level down in the Mayan civilization kind of society, social stratification wise, are the artisans, and they're the skilled kind of artistic workers who produce the tools that the government will use and rely on. So the artisans will produce the handheld tools that are used to create buildings or create canals. The artisans make the farming implements that society relies on. The artisans make the paper and the writing tools that the government needs. So the artisans are like the artists, the productive artists who make the physical implements that that society depends on, and especially the government depends on to continue operating. So the artisans had a higher level of kind of respect and wealth in the society. There's some evidence that suggests that in some cities that certain families were able to establish monopolies over a given trade, say in making pens and paper for the government, and that they were able to train their children to inherit those monopolies, and those families became wealthy in those areas because they cornered the market on the production of those types of goods, and then kept the production secrets to themselves, and that's a way of keeping wealth and power within their own family at the artisan level of the society. And it seems to be that the biggest and richest cities had the biggest artisan classes, which it makes a lot of sense because the biggest cities would require the most government effort and the most government record keeping, and would require the most kind of physical tools to be made for the government to operate. So that would require more artisan workers to do it. The vast majority of Mayan people were born and lived their lives out in the common place, in the common level of society. So commoners were seen as a kind of peasant class. They were mostly farmers who worked on their family farms, often with their extended family. They can often have kind of hereditary inheritance rights over their lands, and work the land with their extended families. But over time, large landowners figured out how to build wealth for themselves and start buying up neighboring plots of land. So over time in Mayan civilization, you see the land being owned by fewer and fewer people as the larger landowners get richer and richer, and eventually most of the common class, the peasant class, simply are kind of wage workers on land that they do not own. Commoners would also be soldiers in the armies to provide, the mass majority of the fighters for the armies. Slaves were usually the lowest class of Mayan society. Slaves were often prisoners of war, enemies from another area that had been captured and brought back to whatever city or government you're talking about, and then often sold as slaves to large landowners or really anyone who could buy one. Slaves could also be convicted criminals from within their own society. They could also be the children of slaves. And slavery was not kind of for all of life. There were some opportunities in Mayan civilization for slaves to escape slavery, usually if their free family members could build up enough wealth to buy their freedom. So if someone was like convicted of a crime or something and enslaved, and their family members were still free and working for wages, if they're able to save enough money, they could buy the freedom of their family member and get them out of slavery. Let's see. So the Mayan were because they're so close to the old Olmec civilization that is now long gone. The Mayan civilization inherited a lot of Olmec kind of scientific advances, especially the so-called long count calendar. So the Mayan will use the Olmec calendars and would keep believing in the Olmec calendar, especially the 5,000 year kind of creation calendar. The Maya also used a lot of other Olmec mathematical advances, used a lot of the Olmec kind of astronomical tables and stories of the kind of cycle of the stars in the sky at night, and also used the Olmec solar calendar to predict the changes in the weather pattern over the year. Let's see. And yeah, so the Maya inherit a lot and use a lot of the kind of highest advances of Olmec civilization. Let's see. The Olmec calendar became known as the Mayan calendar over time, and that's what it's been called more recently today. So there's still fears that some people have that at the end of this 5,000 year cycle, which would be somewhere in the early 2000s, that there's these kind of crazy fears you can read about on the internet about the whole world is going to go into an apocalypse because the Mayan calendar is running out. But it's probably not going to happen because most scientists believe that the Earth and human civilization have been around much longer than just 5,000 years. Let's see. So the Mayan calendar also set out frequent market days where people could bring goods to the marketplace and sell them for money, basically. The most expensive items at these market days were usually jade, cacao beans, which would often substitute for money all by itself because they were so valuable. Merchants could also bring in kind of more advanced types of honey and meat from the forest areas and bring them into the cities to sell for profit. There's this merchant class that's kind of importing and exporting from one region to another, from one city to another. And some of these merchants could really accumulate quite a large fortune in gaining access to a lot of goods for sale, or buying goods in one place where they are fairly cheap, and then packing them up and moving them to another place where those goods are much more rare, and so they're more expensive, and merchants can make a lot of money doing that. Some scholars that study Mayan civilization argue that there's a big conflict between the nobility in different Mayan areas and the kind of rising wealth of the merchants. And so there are some indications that some cities outlawed merchants from dressing in formal clothing that the nobility was allowed to wear, and that the nobility forced merchants to pay tribute, to pay these yearly kinds of taxes to the nobility, to try to cut down on the amount of money that the merchants could save, because they might represent a threat to the nobility at some point if they gain enough wealth and power over time. Mayan warfare was usually based around trying to gather prisoners of war for to be enslaved, to be sold as slaves, or possibly for sacrifice. So Mayan warfare was usually kind of ritualistic. It was not so much about gaining territory and conquering areas as it was about kind of fulfilling a ritual and getting POWs for slavery. The city of Tikal, which again is in the eastern coastline, kind of central eastern coastline of the Mayan civilization, they will be the first to initiate wars that are aimed at conquering territory. So Tikal becomes famous for that, and other areas will kind of fear them greatly. And then other cities will kind of copy what Tikal was doing because it was so successful in expanding Tikal's kind of wealth and power over its neighbors. Mayan warfare was very kind of stylized because a lot of times there wasn't even a gigantic battle. Sometimes it's just a kind of ritual. So the armies might fast, refuse to eat as a religious dedication for several days before the battle would even happen. So you can imagine what that would do to the soldiers that would responsible for actually fighting. Kings would lead rituals before the battles to gain the gods' favor. So the leaders of the army would wear extravagant, stylized clothing and makeup, even to the battlefield itself. So again, most battles were kind of ritualistic. They were largely stalemates. They might capture some enemy leaders for sacrifice in the home city. But you usually don't have these gigantic pitched battles where the armies just go at each other and absolutely annihilate each other and completely destroy each other's leadership. So they were mostly kind of ritualistic over time, even in the kind of land-based conquest wars. The Mayan civilization was one of the few Native American cultures that we know of that created a written language where some of their books actually still survive today. There's not many of those books. There are basically only 4 of them, and they were printed on bark wood, so they don't have a very long-lasting capacity, which is probably why most of the books kind of disappeared over time or were destroyed over time. But we do have access to the Mayan written language. So we believe we know a whole lot more about Mayan civilization because we can read their language than a lot of other native civilizations or any other ancient civilization around the world that we haven't been able to kind of crack their written language yet, so we don't know exactly what their writings on their buildings and whatnot say. But most of the Mayan books and writings on Mayan buildings and whatnot seem to discuss kind of public life, the history of their civilization, the history or the biographies of their leaders, or religious messages. So the classic era of the Mayan civilization ends somewhere between 800 and 900 CE, so 8 to 900 years after zero, when many of the major cities were abandoned. We don't know exactly why that is or why that happened. There's several different kind of major historical theories about how and why that happened. First is that Teotihuacan, which is way up to the northwest at this kind of greenish dot on this map. We have to remember that Teotihuacan collapsed around 750 CE, which may have been a religious center for the whole region, and which may have started a wave of other government declines and collapses throughout the whole area, and which may have disrupted the trade networks and whatnot that the Maya depended on as a civilization. So as that collapse kind of starts in 750 in Teotihuacan and spreads gradually, getting further east toward the Yucatan, that perhaps that started the Mayan decline itself in the 800s at some point. Another big theory is that just the growing populations of the Mayan cities created so much pressure on the farmlands to produce enough food for all these people to eat and survive that some of the Mayan cities might have collapsed just by themselves, just because there's some kind of ecological disaster. There just wasn't enough food to go around in a city. So what do people do at that point? They leave that city and go to another city, which may have overpopulated those cities and caused their collapse, and had a kind of ripple effect throughout the century, throughout the 800s, that may have taken down the Mayan civilization over time. Third and big theory is that there might have been some kind of climate change that started an ecological disaster, which disrupted the food supply and forced people to move around much more, and collapsed the governments, which led to a collapse of the whole civilization. There seems to be the least amount of evidence for the kind of climate change theory that historians can agree on, at least. So historians still debate exactly what caused the Mayan heavy decline in the 800s. Some other areas grow to be very important, especially Chichen Itza, which is way up in the north of the Yucatan Peninsula. That'll be the next area that grows as a major kind of piece of, or the major center of the continuing Mayan civilization. Chichen Itza seemed to have a lot of similarities, culturally at least, with the Toltec that came out of Tula, which is way to the west out by Teotihuacan. But a lot of scholars still dispute that. There's still a lot of debate about how close those connections were. When the Spanish eventually get to the area in the 1500s, Spanish will kind of investigate, and the Spanish will have some historians with them that will kind of write down native testimonies and stories that say that the Toltec had raised an army and eventually conquered the Yucatan and conquered the Mayan civilization. But we don't know how reliable those stories are, because they're being told several hundred years later, up to 600-700 years later. So we don't know if the stories may have changed over time, or people just may have forgotten the details, or may have just been a legend that wasn't true in the first place. But Chichen Itza was the dominant area in the kind of post height Mayan civilization. So as Mayan civilization is declining, Chichen Itza is really the biggest, most important place within the civilization. We believe that Chichen Itza had a kind of council of kings that ruled the city, and used the threat of warfare to control neighboring areas and extract tribute, monthly or yearly payments from areas that were afraid of being invaded. Chichen Itza will start having problems itself at some point in the 1100s CE, and then we believe it is militarily conquered from outside in 1221. And after that, we get the rise of a group that will call itself just the Itza. which appear to have taken over much of the Yucatan, and built a new major city called Mayapan, which is really pretty close to Chichen Itza. Um, it would probably be the biggest Mayan city for the next few hundred years until the Spanish arrive. Mayapan probably had about 15,000 residents or so in it, but it was not the gigantic, imposing city that were built kind of during the height of the Mayan civilization. So its buildings were not monumental; they were not extremely large, and most of their architecture, kind of their architectural ideas, don't seem to have much innovation. They seem to largely be copies from the earlier kind of height of Mayan civilization. Um, the Itza at Mayapan tried to run a very kind of oppressive and economically controlling empire that angered so many Maya that the other kind of holdovers of Mayan civilization that live in the Yucatan will eventually rise up and overthrow Mayapan and the Itza somewhere in the mid 1400s. So Mayan civilization will survive in the Yucatan, even though their cities get depopulated. Their culture survives, their farming methods survive, but again, there will not be any one kind of dominant government at any point, especially after the kind of collapse phase in the 800s. But there are still the Mayan cultural ideas floating around in the Yucatan, even by the time the Spanish start to show up in the early 1500s. And that leads us into the next big section and the dominant empire that will be around in this area in Mesoamerica as a political unified entity, which are the Aztec. The Aztec is a general term for the entire empire that is eventually built, that is centered in what is really today Mexico City. But the Aztec was just the entire entity. There was a subgroup that was in control of this whole place that were called the Mexica. And they are the central group that will run the capital city and will run the empire, and will, launch wars of conquest and force neighboring areas into alliances and pay tribute and whatnot. So the Mexica will run the whole empire from their capital city at Tenochtitlan. And the area that they rule over, their whole empire is called the Aztec Empire. But it's important to notice that the Mexica did not control Tenochtitlan from the beginning. They largely kind of moved into the area from further north. Tenochtitlan was already a city. And the Mexica kind of came down from the old Toltec area after the Toltec collapse. So the Mexica kind of invade southward, getting close to the city of Tenochtitlan. And they kind of move into the area and start to adopt some of the political and social systems they found in the area and try to intermarry with the elite of the area. And the Mexica, though, were much more warlike, much more aggressive than most of the people living in the area around Tenochtitlan, the other kind of cultural and linguistic groups. So the Mexica were not immediately the dominant force. They were just one group amongst many that were living in what is today the kind of valley around Mexico City. They were not the dominant power. They were in fact kind of kicked around. So they couldn't get a foothold in Tenochtitlan for quite a while. And they were forced to work really as mercenaries, as hired soldiers for the more powerful groups. And the Mexica did that because, number one, they're more aggressive and warlike, so they're better at fighting than most of the groups in the area to begin with. And number two, they do this for money and to be given some land to gain a foothold in the area. So most of the neighboring groups, the other cultures, hated the Mexica and viewed them as kind of backward and kind of too aggressive and too warlike and uncultured and just kind of very mean, angry people that you don't want to have much to do with. So the kind of neighboring civilizations tried to keep the Mexica out of their area around Tenochtitlan as much as they possibly could. The Mexica then figured out that their best chance is to occupy part of an island on Lake Texcoco. So they occupy only one part of the island because they figure that this part of one island is the best area where they can kind of set up their own civilization, their own culture, their own political entity, and govern themselves and be able to defend themselves in case they get attacked from all these other neighboring groups that don't like them and don't want them around. So even as they're starting to build their little part of the island for their own defense, they're still working as mercenaries, and they're forced to pay tribute to the more powerful political elite that are governing the whole area. And a lot of that changes under a Mexican king named Quetzalcoatl. So his big innovation is to figure out to form an alliance with a couple of the political groups on the shoreline and use that alliance to attack other groups, these kind of the Mexica plus their two allies would unify their three groups together and attack the more dominant political elites that are running the whole valley. And they were successful in that under his leadership. They conquered the big elite city in 1428, and then after that the rest of the valley kind of fell in line, so that the Mexica are and their two allies are really running the valley now. And the next king in line after Quetzalcoatl, Moctezuma I, figured out how to gain power over those two allies that they had made that original deal with, and then kicked those two allies out of the valley completely, and that gave the Mexica control of the whole valley just themselves by the year 1460. So that was a kind of very kind of a conspiracy to kick out the groups that had helped the original conquest in the first place. And the next king after Moctezuma I would then build armies and go off and start conquering a lot of outlying areas outside of the valley and establish the Mexica as the gigantic empire. So they would conquer in that era from about 1470 or so to 1502, the late 1400s. They would conquer the modern day areas of Oaxaca, Guatemala, and even parts of the Gulf Line coast. So that is what really established the Aztec Empire as a fairly unified, consolidated empire. And in 1502, Moctezuma II would ascend to the Aztec throne, and he would rule by the early 1500s probably hundreds of thousands of residents at the capital city at Tenochtitlan, and perhaps as many as 1.5 million people in the overall Aztec Empire, including all the outlying areas. So now we'll get into kind of some cultural aspects of this new Mexican empire, Mexican culture. Number one, the government, the high political leaders are really in control, and they give out large tracts of lands in the areas that they had conquered to their highest level advisors. So the kind of rich landowners become even richer if they had helped the government conquer those lands in the first place. So we often see that in ancient civilizations with conquest. The government, runs an army out there, and the nobles advise it and make the plans for the conquest. And when the conquest is complete, the conquered land is divided up and handed out to the people who had run the conquest, basically as a payment. So this increased the noble wealth amongst the Mexica astronomically, and war became a business model for the Mexican nobility. They always want to run a new war in some other place to gain more land to enrich themselves even more. So the nobility created a kind of hereditary control over their government positions over a while, because this whole system is enriching and empowering them. So the nobility, if a certain family is kind of in control of a certain part of the army, or a certain family has running the tax collection system, that family figures out over time how to pass their government position on to their children when their children grow up. So their government jobs, their offices, become inherited through the generations. So that means that the children had to be educated, they had to be trained in how to do these jobs, and it completely pushed any likelihood that any commoner or any artisan could ever rise up into the political class or the nobility class. So it really it solidifies a kind of family monopoly over certain government jobs, and it stops the what we call upward mobility chances, the opportunities for people of talent who can build wealth to rise up into the government level. And that often leads to a lot of corruption because families within the government will start to make decisions for the government, mostly based on their own kind of family wealth and their family rivalries with other families, rather than any kind of really great objective decision for the overall government or the overall society. The commoners would be subjected to work requirements, so they would have to work for the government a certain amount of days or weeks per year as a method of paying taxes or paying tribute. And a lot of the commoners were subject to a military draft. So that makes a lot of sense, because if the commoners don't have the ability to rise up into the government level, the political class, and if the commoners don't really get much out of the conquest because the elites are taking up all the conquered land, then why would the commoners join the military willingly in the first place? They wouldn't, logically, so they had to be drafted into the military. A lot of areas and people that the Mexica conquered and brought into their Aztec Empire, if they had been landowners before they were conquered, the land would be taken from them, and if they survived the conquest, if they weren't killed, they would often be transitioned into being commoners, and they would work very often on the same land that they had formerly owned, and they would basically be wage workers for the new owners, which were the Mexican conquerors. Some former landowners were enslaved, and commoners of conquered areas sometimes were enslaved also. Merchants and artisans mostly worked in the capital city, Tenochtitlan. So Tenochtitlan would have a massive population by the early 1500s, far larger than any city that the Spanish or the Portuguese would come from. So when the Spanish eventually got to Tenochtitlan, they're absolutely floored at the size of the thing and the complexity and the prosperity of the city, because the Spanish cities were just a fraction of its size. So the merchants could build wealth through trade. Same thing as we've talked about before. The merchants would figure out where they could buy goods fairly cheaply where they're common in other places of the empire, and then transport those goods to the capital city where they're rarer, so that they could sell those goods for higher prices and enrich themselves, make a lot of profit. So the merchants could become very wealthy if they were good at that stuff, but again, they could not use that wealth to rise into government positions because the political class had monopolized it. A lot of families would use arranged marriages to make alliances with different families. So they would, if I am the father running a merchant family business, I would try to marry my children, maybe have like one or two of my children, train them in running the business so that they could take over when I go to retire. But if I have several children, I would try to take those other children that are not being groomed to run the business and marry them into the political families, or other merchant families, to try to bring the businesses together. So very oftentimes I would kind of make deals with other families to marry our children together for the mutual benefit of both of our families. So perhaps a political class family that isn't running their business very well. They have government power, but they want to gain access to wealth. So they might marry one of their children to my merchant family children to build that kind of interfamily alliance for the long term. Um, Women often in Mexican civilization and the Aztec Empire, they often held kind of what we would think of as female-specific roles in government or religion. Um, they would be kind of supportive of the men. They would run households when men were away. So women had these kind of gendered roles in Mexican society in the Aztec Empire. But they had, circumstances would bring opportunities for some women. So when the men that were, formerly running the business, if they kind of went to another city for a while, the women of the family or a specific woman would run the family business, and it could be very trustworthy if she ran it well, and kind of might rise in the family's estimation to higher levels of the business or politics because they have proven themselves to be able to do a good job. Some women ran their own trading merchant businesses even without men around. Some women through those businesses were able to set market prices, especially if they're involved with their men in their family in the business. When the men are away, the women could set the market values for trade and the prices that they want to sell their goods for. Women could own their own property in the civilization, and they could inherit property from their family. So women are not as fully oppressed and repressed, even though they traditionally would have kind of gendered roles. There were opportunities for them to kind of break out of those roles and establish themselves as reliable business partners or reliable decision makers of some kind. The Aztec Empire was almost completely built around agriculture, farming, so that's its economic kind of heart. And one thing to realize about Mesoamerican culture, they didn't have any large kind of work animals. They didn't have the llamas that were common in South America. They didn't have horses or cattle so much. So a lot of the kind of muscle work that was required for farming was largely done by people themselves. Whereas in Europe or other ancient civilizations, they had access to horses or kind of farming animals to do a lot of the digging in the ground or whatnot. And the capital city was based on a lake. The capital city, because it was built on this lake, they built kind of lattice work to place on top of the lake and put soil on top of the lattice work and then planted crops into the soil, so that the crops could grow down through the soil, the roots, and they would be able to access the lake water on a consistent basis. And because this is modern day Mexico City, there's a lot of sunshine throughout the year. So the Mexican crop base in Tenochtitlan was probably one of the healthiest and most abundant harvest of any ancient civilization throughout the whole world. So this mud lattice work that were built were called chinampas. And this was one of the big bases of a lot of Mexican prosperity, because they had so much food and such healthy food, grown as what we today call kind of hydroponics methods. So it's an extremely prosperous society and a very healthy society because they're eating better food than almost any other ancient civilization, and they have consistent access to that food. But that type of labor on the lake-based capital city required massive amounts of labor and also tribute from the conquered areas to keep its population growing and provided for. So we believe that the Mexica were polytheists. They believed in many gods. And that one of probably their most important god demanded what we call human sacrifice. So human sacrifice becomes a gigantic thing, one of the central things in the Mexican culture and the Mexican religion. They probably inherited or learned about the idea of bloodletting from a lot of the previous Mesoamerican cultures that we've already talked about. So Mesoamericans have been doing this bloodletting, especially amongst the kind of royal family type stuff, for many, many generations, going back hundreds and hundreds of years. And the Mexica seem to have just kind of scaled this up to an unprecedented level for full board kind of human sacrifice on a pretty consistent basis. Some of the Mesoamerican cultures before had used human sacrifice, but in very kind of rare instances and very special circumstances, whereas the Mexica, the Aztec Empire, will use human sacrifice on a consistent basis on a much, much larger and bloodier scale than anything that was previously seen. So basically the idea was that the gods demanded human sacrifice in order to ensure that when the sun went down at the end of the day, that it needed some kind of blood sacrifice to give it the power to rise the next day or in the next season. And if you look at kind of sunsets fairly consistently and sunrises, they're usually very red skies, and that seems to have been, in the Mexica mind, kind of compared to the redness of the blood. So warriors in the Mexican armies came to be told and believed that dying on the battlefield or in sacrifice as a prisoner of war would guarantee their immediate access into the kind of heavenly afterlife scenario. So a lot of Aztec wars for conquest were not just wars to gain land, but they were often fought to gain prisoners, to take enemy prisoners and bring them back to the capital city and sacrifice them. So any rebels that tried to rise up or lead rebellions against the Aztec Empire, if they were captured, they'd often be brought back for sacrifice. Prisoners of war, convicted criminals, or even slaves could often be sacrificed, and even in front of their own leaders in the Mexican capital, as a lesson to those leaders. So if the leaders lost a war and several of their soldiers were taken prisoner, the Mexica wouldn't just take the prisoners back to Tenochtitlan for sacrifice. They would order and force the political leaders of the places that were just conquered to travel with them, so that the political leaders would be forced to watch the sacrifice of their own soldiers, and they'd probably be horrified at it. And Mexica would tell them, this is going to happen to you too if you don't follow orders and if you try to rebel against the empire. So the message is, this is what happens to troublemakers, basically, and that kept a lot of people in line. And one famous story is that the opening of a brand new temple to this highly important god, went on the kind of opening ceremonies, 20,000 people were sacrificed. So this is a human sacrifice on an unprecedented level again. It was much, much larger than anything any Mesoamerican civilization had done before or would really do even afterward. And this led to a lot of hatred from groups that were conquered and that were part of the Aztec Empire, not by choice, but because they were conquered, because they heard the stories of what happened to their POWs who were taken away. And they, were horrified at it, and they hated the Mexica for doing this and for victimizing them in this way. So a lot of the conquered peoples in the Aztec Empire felt exploited. They had to pay tribute and taxes. Their political leaders were very afraid of the Mexica and hated the Mexica also. And so they're often looking for a good opportunity to rebel, but they're so afraid of the Mexica that they're not going to do it by themselves. So they wait for a kind of revolutionary movement to start that might help them break away from the Mexica and gain independence again. So they will see the Spanish invasions in the early 1500s as that good opportunity, and a lot of these kind of angry groups within the Aztec Empire will make deals with the invading Spanish to help the Spanish invade and conquer and destroy the Mexica, hoping that the Spanish will, not be as brutal as conquerors as the Mexica were. So this will play out politically in the next few lectures as well, able to conquer this gigantic empire that in theory has somewhere around 1.5 million people in it, and could theoretically build a gigantic army to keep the Spanish out, to counterattack the Spanish. But a lot of members of that possible army don't like the Mexica in the first place, and they're looking for a good opportunity to rebel. So we'll see all this play out a little bit later, and we'll stop here for the day. That pretty much brings us up to the 1500s, and we'll start moving into the kind of Spanish influence and the Spanish attacks later.